What if the person you trusted the most was the one who destroyed you? Clara was just a child when the nightmare began, a little girl who lost her parents and was forced into the care of a man the world saw as holy, righteous, and untouchable. But behind closed doors, behind the stained glass windows of the church, Clara saw a different man. A monster, a predator hiding behind the pulpit. 4 years, she suffered in silence, she prayed, she cried, she begged for a savior, but no one came, because how do you fight a man that everyone worships? How do you expose the devil when he's wearing a priest's robe? Clara suffered in silence, carrying wounds no one could see, drowning in fear, in shame. Because who would believe her? Who would stand against a man so powerful, so respected? But one day, something inside her woke up. Clara decided she wouldn't be silent anymore, and that was the moment her battle truly began. This is not just a story about pain, it is a story about courage, about justice, about a girl who dared to speak against the man who thought he was untouchable. But the question is, will the world believe her? Or will she be swallowed by the very system that was supposed to protect her? But here's the question, will Clara get justice? Or will the world turn against her, protecting the man who stole her innocence and her childhood? Stay with me till the end, because Clara's story is not just hers, it is the story of every silenced voice, every hidden scar, every girl who was told to pray instead of fighting. Before we'll begin this gripping true story, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like and share this video, and comment where you are watching from. The courtroom was silent. The only sound came from the rustling of papers as the judge adjusted his glasses. Clara stood in the witness box, her hands trembling slightly. Across the room, sitting in the defendant's chair, was Pastor Anthony. His usually commanding presence had withered, and his eyes, once filled with the deceptive warmth that had fooled so many, were now dark with shame. She inhaled sharply. This was it, the moment she had waited for, but as she opened her mouth to speak, the past came rushing back like a flood, drowning her in memories she had spent years trying to suppress. Clara's childhood had been a happy one until tragedy struck. Her father, a loving and hardworking man, died in a ghastly car accident on his way home from work. The news shattered their world. Her mother, devastated, struggled to keep their small family afloat. But fate was cruel. 3 days later, while preparing dinner, Clara's mother collapsed. The neighbors rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late, she died. High blood pressure had claimed her life. Just like that, 10-year-old Clara became an orphan. With no immediate relatives willing to take her in, Clara found herself under the care of Mummy Tola, one of their neighbors, a close friend of Clara's mum. The woman was kind but had her own struggles. She was poor, she was barely able to feed Clara. Then, one Sunday after church, Pastor Anthony arrived, his face full of exaggerated concern. "Let me take her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's my own blood. I will raise her like my own daughter." Clara had heard little about her uncle before then. He was her late father's younger brother, a well-respected pastor with a growing congregation. The church members admired him for his charity work and powerful sermons. When he spoke, people listened. And so, with gratitude in her heart, Clara packed her small bag and left with Pastor Anthony and his wife, Auntie Esther. At first, things seemed fine. Their house was much bigger than the small apartment she had lived in with her parents. It had polished tiles, beautiful curtains, and a constant supply of electricity. But something felt off. The first night, as she lay in bed in the tiny guest room they had given her, she felt it, the unsettling feeling of being watched. Days turned into weeks, and Clara quickly learned her place. Auntie Esther had no interest in raising another child. She assigned Clara the most tedious chores in the house: scrubbing the floors, washing piles of dishes, and waking up before dawn to fetch water. Every mistake Clara made earned her harsh words, sometimes even a slap. "Useless girl," Auntie Esther would mutter. "You think because your father was my husband's brother, you can come here and eat for free?" Pastor Anthony, on the other hand, was different. He rarely scolded her. In fact, he was overly kind. Too kind. He brought her gifts, new clothes, shoes, and sweets. At first, she was grateful, but soon, the gifts came with strange looks, lingering touches, and an unsettling closeness. One night, as she was clearing the dining table, he stood too close behind her. His breath was warm against her neck. "You know," Clara, he murmured, placing his hand on her waist, you're growing into a beautiful young woman. Her stomach twisted with unease. She didn't understand why, but something about his words felt wrong. Auntie Esther, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see, continued her cruelty. She made Clara sleep on a thin mat in the hallway, poured cold water on her when she overslept, and often sent her to bed without food. Clara endured. She had nowhere else to go. But she could feel that something dark was coming. The feeling of being watched at night grew stronger. The fear coiled around her heart like a snake, tightening its grip with each passing day. Then, one night, she heard it. A whisper at her door. Clara opened the door. Her heart slammed against her chest. She pulled the blanket over her head, hoping it was a dream. But the whisper came again, more insistent. Clara, don't be afraid. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying, wishing she could disappear. The doorknob rattled. Tears streamed down her face as she curled into herself, holding her breath. Then suddenly, the door opened. It was her uncle, Pastor Anthony. He stood on the doorway, trying to enter Clara's room that night. He wanted to touch her, to feel the heat of her skin beneath his fingers, to have something of her that was his, even if it was stolen in the dead of night. Then just as he was about touching Clara, he heard sounds of footsteps coming towards Clara's room. Pastor Anthony's heart skipped, a surge of panic rising in his throat. He froze, breath caught, listening to the growing sound of footsteps coming closer, closer to her room. A cold sweat prickled his skin. He held his head with his two hands. I should not be caught, I can't risk it. His hands trembled as he pulled away from her, his mind racing for an escape. He couldn't stay, there was no time to waste. He turned quickly, barely looking back, and fled, leaving Clara's door wide open and vulnerable. His only thought was to disappear before anyone sees him. Clara exhaled shakily. She had survived that night. But deep down, she knew the nightmare was just beginning. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Clara avoided Pastor Anthony as much as she could, but it wasn't always possible. He watched her constantly, his eyes filled with something that made her skin crawl. One evening, while Auntie Esther was out visiting a church member, Clara busied herself in the kitchen, washing the pots from dinner. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then, she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze. Her grip on the sponge tightened as the hairs on her arms stood on end. She didn't dare turn around. She knew who it was. Clara. Pastor Anthony's voice was soft, almost coaxing. She swallowed. Yes, sir. Come here. Her breath hitched. No, not again. She couldn't. I'm washing plates, she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible. I said, come here. His voice held no room for argument now. Slowly, she turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was standing by the kitchen door, blocking the exit. His eyes roamed over her, and she felt exposed, like a trapped animal. He stepped forward. She stepped back. Why are you acting scared, my dear? His voice was almost a whisper. You know I love you. Clara's fingers dug into the wet sponge in her hands. Please, sir, I need to finish my work. He chuckled, shaking his head. You're a stubborn girl. But that's okay. I like that. She felt her chest tighten with fear. He was too close now. She could smell his cologne, mixed with something darker, something that made her stomach turn. Then, just as he reached for her, a knock on the front door shattered the tension. Clara bolted. She pushed past him, dashing out of the kitchen and racing toward the door. She flung it open, gasping for breath. It was the neighbor's teenage son, Daniel. Ah, Clara, Daniel said, frowning. Are you okay? She nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. Behind her, Pastor Anthony had composed himself. He smiled at Daniel. Young man, what do you want? My mother said I should return the food container Auntie Esther brought earlier. Daniel handed over a plastic bowl. Pastor Anthony took it, his face calm, but Clara could see the storm in his eyes. Tell your mother we appreciate it, he said smoothly. Daniel nodded, but his eyes lingered on Clara for a moment longer before he left. As soon as the door closed, Pastor Anthony turned to Clara, his jaw tight. You think someone will always come to save you? While he was talking to Clara, he heard a knock on the door. Clara rushed to open the door. Surprisingly, it was his wife. "Honey, you are back so quick." Pastor Anthony pretended as if nothing was happening. Auntie Esther responded, "Yes, my husband, I had a few things to buy in the market." Clara quickly collected the bags from Auntie Esther. She took them directly to the kitchen. The following days after that day felt like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. Clara knew Pastor Anthony was furious. His cold stares burned through her skin. His silence was more terrifying than his words. He hadn't tried anything since Daniel and his wife unknowingly saved her, but the air in the house was thick with tension, suffocating and heavy. Auntie Esther, oblivious as always, continued treating Clara like a housemaid. Even though she noticed how Clara behaved whenever her husband walked by, she wasn't interested. All she cared about was ensuring Clara did the house chores every day. She was not concerned about Clara's well-being. As Clara lay on her thin mat that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, the house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the sitting room. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to escape, but where would she go? Who would believe her? She squeezed her eyes shut. "God, please. I just want to be safe. Please, help me." Then she heard it. A creak. A slow, deliberate creak of the wooden floor just outside her door. Her eyes flew open, heart pounding. She held her breath, listening. Then, the doorknob rattled. No. Clara's stomach clenched. She had locked it. She always locked it. But she could hear the slow turn of the handle as if someone was testing it, seeing if she had let her guard down. Lo and behold, the door was open. It was her uncle, Pastor Anthony. He had a spare key to Clara's room. He forcefully opened the door and grabbed Clara aggressively. Clara tried to defend herself, but she was overpowered by her uncle. He closed her mouth while he was making love with her that night, making sure she did not scream. In about 5 minutes, Pastor Anthony was done touching Clara. He quickly retreated to his room, leaving Clara sorrowful and heartbroken. Clara exhaled shakily, tears spilling down her cheeks. She couldn't stay here anymore. She had to get out. The next morning, Clara forced herself to act normal, even as exhaustion weighed her down. Auntie Esther barked orders at her as usual, demanding she prepare breakfast. Clara moved like a robot, her mind elsewhere. She had a plan. A reckless, desperate plan. School was Clara's only safe space. Pastor Anthony never tried anything there, not in public. If she could just tell someone, but who? The teachers respected Pastor Anthony. He was a man of God. Who would believe an orphan over a well-known pastor? Clara blinked back tears. No, she couldn't give up before she even tried. After breakfast, she left for school, her heart hammering in her chest. The moment she stepped into the school compound, she felt like she could breathe again. The sounds of students chatting, teachers moving in and out of classrooms, it was a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of Pastor Anthony's house. She spotted Amaka near the assembly hall and hurried toward her. Amaka was her closest friend, the only person who noticed when Clara was gentle than usual. "Clara." Amaka beamed, tossing her braids over her shoulder. "Why do you look like someone stole your lunch money?" Clara forced a smile. "I need to talk to you." Amaka's smile faded at Clara's serious tone. She pulled her aside. "What's wrong?" Clara hesitated, her throat tightening. "It's my uncle, Pastor Anthony." Amaka's brows furrowed. "What about him?" Clara swallowed hard. "He has been touching me every night." Her voice broke, and her eyes stung with tears. Amaka's face darkened. "Clara, what are you saying? Are you serious?" Clara nodded quickly, looking away. Amaka sucked in a sharp breath. No, this can't continue. You have to tell someone. A teacher or anyone. Who will believe me?" Clara whispered. "He is a pastor, everyone respects him." "I believe you," Amaka said firmly. "And we're going to find someone who will, too." Amaka dragged Clara to the staff room before she could protest. The teachers were preparing for class, but their English teacher, Mrs. Basie, looked up as they entered. "Yes. What is it?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Clara's heart pounded. She was afraid, she could not talk. But then she felt Amaka's hand squeeze hers. "Tell her," Amaka whispered. Clara took a deep breath. "Ma, I need help." Mrs. Basie frowned. "What's wrong, Clara?" "It's my uncle," Clara began, her voice trembling. "Pastor Anthony. He has been touching me lately every night," she broke off, shaking. Mrs. Basie's eyes widened. The staff room went quiet. "Clara," she said carefully, "are you sure about what you're saying? This is a very serious accusation." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I wouldn't lie about this, Ma. I swear. Please, help me." Mrs. Basie's lips pressed into a thin line. She stood up and placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "You did the right thing coming to me. We need to report this immediately." Clara felt a lump in her throat. Was this really happening? Was someone finally going to help her? "We're going to the principal's office right now," Mrs. Basie said. "Amaka, you should come, too." Amaka nodded firmly. "I am not leaving her alone." As they walked out of the staff room, Clara felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. She felt she wasn't alone any longer. And maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would finally come to an end. Clara sat in the principal's office, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat as she tried to process the fact that she had finally spoken out. After months of suffering in silence, she had said it out loud. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. Principal Dyke, a stern-looking man in his 50s, sat behind his massive wooden desk, tapping a pen against his palm. His eyes studied Clara, his expression unreadable. Next to her, Mrs. Basie sat upright, her face a mixture of concern and quiet rage. Amaka, ever her protector, was holding her hand tightly. "Clara," Principal Dyke finally spoke, his deep voice heavy with authority, "what you've just accused Pastor Anthony of is extremely serious." "I know," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are absolutely sure of what you're saying?" "Yes, sir. He has been doing this for a long time," she said, with tears flowing down her eyes. "I can't take it anymore." The principal let out a long breath. "We have to proceed carefully. This is not just a family matter, it concerns the law." Clara bit her lip. "But will anyone believe me? He's a respected pastor. Everyone thinks he's a saint." Mrs. Basie leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Clara, we believe you, and I promise you, we will do everything we can to protect you." Amaka nodded fiercely. "You're not alone in this." Principal Dyke stood up and reached for his phone. "We have to report this to the authorities immediately. But first, I need to call your uncle, Pastor Anthony." Clara's blood ran cold. "No. You can't call him. If he finds out, he will be angry. He has warned me several times not to tell anyone." "He will find out," the principal said gravely. "But he won't have the power to harm you anymore. We will make sure of that." Clara swallowed hard. This was happening too fast than she expected. The school called in the police. Within an hour, 2 uniformed officers arrived, their presence causing murmurs to ripple through the hallways. Students peeked from their classrooms as the officers were ushered into the principal's office. Clara felt like she was floating outside of her own body. Everything was moving so fast. 1 minute, she was suffering in silence, and now, the law was involved. One of the officers, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, introduced himself as Inspector Adeyemi. His voice was calm, reassuring. "Clara, we understand that this is very difficult for you, but we need you to tell us everything. Take your time." Clara took a shaky breath and recounted everything: every touch, every whisper, every night she had spent terrified and abused in that house. Her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Principal Dyke, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, had a grim expression on his face. Inspector Adeyemi nodded solemnly. "We will take this very seriously. We will bring Pastor Anthony in for questioning. But Clara, we also need to ensure your safety." Clara's heart pounded. "Where will I go?" "We will arrange for you to be taken into protective custody," the inspector assured her. "You won't have to go back to that house." Relief crashed over Clara in waves. She was finally escaping. An hour later, after the police left, the office door swung open. Pastor Anthony walked in, his face a perfect mask of confusion and concern. He was dressed in his usual crisp white shirt and black trousers, his Bible tucked under his arm like a shield. "Good afternoon, sir," he greeted, his voice smooth, controlled. "I was told there was an urgent matter concerning my niece." Clara felt herself shrink into the chair. Principal Dyke cleared his throat. "Pastor Anthony, please sit down." He did, his eyes darting to Clara before focusing on the principal. "What is this about?" Mrs. Basie wasted no time. "Your niece, Clara, has come forward with allegations against you." Pastor Anthony's eyes widened in perfect shock. "Allegations? Against me? What kind of allegations?" Clara's fists clenched. He was playing the innocent card so well it made her sick. Principal Dyke's expression was grim. "She has accused you of touching her every night." "I would never." Pastor Anthony cut in sharply. "This is ridiculous. Clara, my own niece, accusing me of such wickedness. What has gotten into you?" Clara flinched but held her ground. "You know what you did," she said, her voice shaking. "Stop pretending." Pastor Anthony shook his head. "I raised you, fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay me." He turned to Principal Dyke. "Sir, I fear Clara has been influenced by something or someone. Perhaps she has fallen into bad company." Mrs. Basie scoffed. "That's a classic deflection, Pastor. Instead of defending yourself, you're attacking the victim." Pastor Anthony exhaled, shaking his head. "This is absurd. Where is the proof?" "There will be an investigation," Principal Dyke said firmly. "The authorities will handle this from here." For the first time, something flickered in Pastor Anthony's eyes, a crack in the perfect mask. "The authorities," he echoed. "Yes," the principal confirmed. "The police have been notified." A tense silence followed. Then Pastor Anthony stood, his movements slow, controlled. "I see," he said, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "Well, I have nothing to hide." He turned to Clara, his eyes dark. "I am deeply hurt that you would do this to me. But the truth will always prevail." He turned on his heel and walked out. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. That evening, Clara stayed with Mrs. Basie. The teacher had insisted she wouldn't let Clara return to that house. "Did we do the right thing?" Clara whispered as they sat in the dimly lit living room. Mrs. Basie placed a hand over hers. "Yes, Clara. You did the bravest thing anyone in your position could do." Clara nodded, but deep down, a nagging fear wouldn't let go. Pastor Anthony wasn't the type to go down quietly. And something told her the storm wasn't over yet. The night was thick with silence, yet Clara's mind was anything but quiet. She lay on the couch in Mrs. Basie's modest apartment, her body curled tightly under a warm blanket. The events of the day replayed in her head over and over, each moment weighing heavily on her chest. Pastor Anthony had walked out of that office calm, too calm it unsettled her. The man she knew never took threats lightly. What was he planning? A soft knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her breath caught in her throat, but Mrs. Basie, who was in the small kitchen, called out reassuringly, "It's just a marker, dear." Clara exhaled shakily as a marker stepped in, her eyes scanning Clara's face with concern. "Are you okay?" a marker asked, sitting beside her. Clara gave a weak nod. "I really don't know if I should be relieved, but I feel like something bad is coming." A marker frowned. "That man has been getting away with evil for too long. It's time he faces the consequences." Clara sighed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. I don't trust him. He has power and influence. What if no one believes me? What if?" "Stop that." A marker gripped her hand. "They will believe you, and even if they don't, we'll fight until they do. You are not alone, Clara." Clara's eyes burned with tears. For years, she had carried this burden alone. Now, for the first time, someone was standing beside her. The next morning, Clara was called to the police station for an official statement. Mrs. Basie went with her, her presence a firm support. The station was a small, busy place with officers moving in and out, some filling paperwork, others dealing with rowdy suspects. A female officer, Inspector Amina, sat across from Clara, a recorder on the desk. She had a kind yet firm expression. "Clara," she said, "tell me everything. From the beginning." Clara took a deep breath and started talking. Every horrible memory, every painful detail. It was as if she was vomiting out poison that had been rotting inside her for years. By the time she was done, her voice was hoarse, and her hands were shaking. Inspector Amina nodded, her expression unreadable. "We will investigate this thoroughly, but, Clara, I must warn you, cases like this are difficult. He is a respected figure, and people will fight to protect him. Are you prepared for that?" Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I have to try." The officer gave a small smile. "That's bravery, my dear, and we will do our best to get you justice." By the next day, news had spread. It started as whispers in the neighborhood, then exploded on social media. Clara's name wasn't mentioned in the public allegations, but people knew. The students whispered, teachers exchanged glances, and church members argued in hushed tones. Some were furious a man of God would never do such a thing, while others were doubtful but quiet. A small group, mostly women, started murmuring that maybe, just maybe, Clara wasn't the only victim. Over the next Sunday, the church was packed as always. The choir sang, the ushers directed people to their seats, and the air buzzed with tension. Pastor Anthony walked to the pulpit, his usual commanding presence undiminished. He opened his Bible, exhaled deeply, and then spoke. "My dear brothers and sisters, a great evil has been set against me." His voice quivered just enough to sound pained. "I have been falsely accused by the one I love dearly. The devil is at work, trying to tarnish my image." Gasps filled the room. Some women shook their heads, muttering, "God forbid." He continued, "I have given my life to this ministry, to serving God's people. But as the Bible says in Isaiah 54 verse 17, no weapon fashioned against me shall prosper." A roar of amen echoed in the church. Clara, watching from a distance on a Marcus phone, because Pastor Anthony's Sunday program was always televised, she felt sick. He was turning it into a spiritual battle, and people were falling for it. He even shed tears while he was talking. Then came the dagger to her heart. "I forgive her," Pastor Anthony said, his voice breaking. "Because I know she is being used by the enemy, I will continue to pray for her." "God bless you, Pastor," someone shouted within the congregation. Clara's grip tightened on the phone. He was playing the victim, and it was working. Mrs. Basie turned off the video. "Don't let it shake you. People like him manipulate others. The truth will come out." Clara wasn't so sure. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Mrs. Basie's house. A church elder had delivered it personally. "Clara, my child, I love you as my own daughter. It pains me that you have chosen this path of lies. I forgive you. Come home, and let us fix this as a family. Do not let the enemy use you. If you continue, you will only bring shame upon yourself. The world will not believe you. But I do. Come back home. Pastor Anthony." Clara read it, her hands shaking. "This is psychological warfare," Mrs. Basie said firmly. "He's trying to guilt trip you. You are not going back there." Clara knew that, but deep down, his words still had power, not because she believed them, but because she knew how easily others would. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his fake concern, his crocodile tears, his veiled threats. But she also saw something else. The face of every girl who had ever been silenced. She sat up suddenly. No, she would not be one of them. She grabbed her phone and opened her social media app with trembling fingers. She typed, "My name is Clara. And this is my story," she continued typing. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the screen of her phone, waiting the moment she posted it on social media. There was no turning back. Her story was out in the world now, raw and unfiltered. She expected an immediate reaction, but for a few agonizing minutes, there was silence. Then, her phone buzzed. Once, twice, then, a flood of notifications on her social media account. Comments, shares, messages. Some people who commented on her post were supportive. "You're so brave for speaking out. Stay strong. I believe you. These men have gotten away with too much for too long." But others were cruel. "Liar. You want to destroy a man of God. God will punish you." Attention seeker, shameless girl. Clara swallowed hard, her hands shaking. She had known this would happen, but the sheer weight of it felt suffocating. Mrs. Basie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Don't read the hateful ones, dear. They will always be there. Amaka nodded, scrolling through her own phone. But look, some women are speaking up. Some are saying they had similar experiences with him with Pastor Anthony. Clara's breath caught. Really? She grabbed her phone again, scrolling past the hateful messages to find them. I thought I was the only one. He did the same to me when I was 14. I was too scared to say anything, but it's time people know the truth. Her heart ached. It wasn't just her she had suspected, but seeing it confirmed made her stomach churn. How many girls had he hurt? Clara asked. And how many more would he hurt if she didn't keep fighting? The next day, Clara woke up to another storm, this time on the news. A major news outlet had picked up her story. The headline flashed across the screen. Allegations against prominent pastor spark controversy. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. She hadn't expected it to spread this fast. I told you, Amaka said with a small smile. The truth always finds a way. But even as she said it, Clara's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered. Hello. A deep, calm voice spoke. Clara, it's me. Her blood ran cold. Pastor Anthony. She gripped the phone tighter. What do you want? A sigh. Clara, my child, you are making a terrible mistake. Don't call me that. I am not your child, Clara said emphatically. Pastor Anthony continued. You are being used. Clara, these people around you, they are poisoning your mind. But I still forgive you. Come back, and we will make this go away. You don't want to destroy yourself, do you? Clara clenched her jaw. I'm not the one who should be bothered of being destroyed. While on the phone, Pastor Anthony got angry. He spoke authoritatively. Keep quiet, Clara. His voice turned cold. You think the world will believe you? You think you can win against me? Clara's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. I don't think I know. She hung up. Her stomach churned. He was indeed scared. That meant she was doing something right. But Pastor Anthony wasn't going down without a fight. The next Sunday, he stood before his congregation again. This time, his voice was laced with righteous anger. My children, the enemy is working hard. Several lies have been spread about me, but I stand before you, a servant of God, innocent before him. The church roared in agreement. Yes, Pastor. He turned to the cameras. To those who seek to destroy me, I say, God is my defender. And he will fight my battles. More cheers. Then, he played his final card. I forgive my accuser, but she needs prayers. She is lost. Let us pray for her. The whole church stood up to pray for Clara, in agreement to Pastor Anthony, please. Clara watched in horror on TV as people fell to their knees, hands raised, calling on God to save her soul. He's turning them against me, she whispered. His desperate Mrs. Basie corrected. That means you're winning. Clara wasn't sure, because as the days passed, the backlash grew. She received threats. People from the church sent her hateful messages, and even strangers online hurled insults at her. But she also received messages from other girls, thanking her for her courage. Some of them were ready to come forward to narrate their experiences and ordeals they had with Pastor Anthony. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. One evening, a knock came at the door. When Clara opened it, she froze. A woman stood there. Older, well-dressed, her face lined with worry. I need to talk to you, she said softly. Clara hesitated. Who are you? The woman exhaled deeply. My name is Mrs. Adekunle. I used to be Pastor Anthony's wife before I divorced him. Clara's breath caught. His ex-wife. She nodded. Yes, and I know what he's capable of. Clara exchanged a glance with Mrs. Basie and Amaka, then stepped aside. Come in. As the woman entered, Clara knew one thing for certain. She was about to learn the darkest secrets of Pastor Anthony. And she would use them to bring him down. Mrs. Adekunle encouraged Clara never to give up in her fight. She narrated how she caught Pastor Anthony defiling young girls on several occasions. Mrs. Adekunle promised to support Clara in whatever way, to make sure fair justice is served. The next few days were a whirlwind. more survivors came forward. Women, some even older than Clara, shared their horrifying experiences. The patterns were the same: manipulation, threats, spiritual abuse. The church remained silent at first, but the pressure was growing. The police had reopened their investigation, and social media was exploding with calls for justice. Some called her brave, others called Clara a liar. A few women started sharing their own stories, whispers of things Pastor Anthony had done in the past but had been swept under the rug. The church tried to suppress it, but the floodgates had opened, and the internet does not forget. Then came the bombshell. A journalist picked up the story. "Clara, we have a chance to take this even further," the journalist, a young woman named Ifini, said over a phone call. "Would you be willing to do a televised interview?" Clara hesitated. The thought of exposing herself even more made her stomach turn, but this wasn't just about her anymore. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I will do it." The cameras were blinding. The studio smelled like coffee and nerves. Clara sat across from Ifini, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Clara," Ifini began, "why did you decide to speak out now?" Clara took a deep breath. "Because silence was killing me, because I realized that if I stayed quiet, he would do this to someone else." "What do you say to those who don't believe you?" Clara met the camera's gaze. "I say, look at the pattern. Look at the other girls coming forward. Look at the fear in their eyes. Are we all lying?" The interview was raw and emotional, and it shook the country. But then, as expected, the backlash came. Pastor Anthony fights back. A day after the interview aired, Pastor Anthony held a press conference. He stood at the pulpit, surrounded by church elders, his voice thick with righteous anger. "Brothers and sisters, I have been falsely accused by someone I took in as my own." He shook his head, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "The enemy is trying to destroy me." The congregation erupted in amens. "And then I will not take legal action. I will forgive her, just as Christ forgave his enemies." It was a masterful move. By refusing to sue, he painted himself as the innocent victim. Then, just when she thought things could not get worse, the police arrived at Mrs. Bass's house. "Miss Clara Okafor, you're under arrest for defamation." Clara's blood turned to ice. "What? No, he's the one who..." The officer shook his head. "A case has been filed against you. You need to come with us." Amaka screamed, "This is madness." Mrs. Bassey demanded, "Where is your warrant? Who filed this?" But Clara already knew. It was Pastor Anthony. He was already retaliating. The cell was cold and dark. The smell of sweat and desperation clung to the air. Clara curled up on the hard bench, hugging her knees to her chest. She had never felt so alone. Then, a voice called her name. "A guard, you have a visitor." She stepped out, and her breath caught. It was Ifini, the journalist, and she wasn't alone. Behind her stood two lawyers. "Clara, we are getting you out of here. And we are going to make sure Pastor Anthony never does this to anyone again." Tears burned Clara's eyes. For the first time in days, hope flickered inside her. Within hours, she was released on bail, and this time, she wasn't just fighting with her voice, she had a lawyer on her side. The courtroom was packed. The media swarmed the entrance. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. The prosecution presented their case. Clara stood in the witness box, narrating how Pastor Anthony touched her every night. Pastor Anthony had a good lawyer, who defended him outrightly. The case was going in his favor because his lawyer was well experienced. But this time, it wasn't enough. Surprisingly, Pastor Anthony's ex-wife Mrs. Adeyemi stepped in. Pastor Anthony was indeed shocked to see her. Mrs. Adeyemi raised up her hand. She signaled. The court was in awe by her presence. She stood up with courage. "My lordship, I have something to say in support of Clara's case. I am Mrs. Adeyemi, Pastor Anthony's ex-wife. I have caught him severally abusing young girls, and he has blamed it severally on the devil. I forgave him severally as my husband until it was unbearable. I had no choice but to divorce him." Just as Mrs. Adeyemi finished, another witness stood up. Her name was Funmi. She was a choir in Pastor Anthony's church before she left. Funmi exhaled shakily with tears in her eyes. "I was 16, he said I was special, that I was chosen by God to be close to him. At first, he was kind, like a father. Then, he started asking me to stay behind after choir practice. It escalated. The first time he did it to me was in his office. After choir practice, I told my mother about what he did. She said I was possessed, that I should pray for forgiveness. My mum trusted Pastor Anthony so much, she didn't believe me. My mother called Pastor Anthony and told him everything. You know what he did? He cried. He told her the devil was trying to use me to destroy his ministry. My mother made me kneel before Pastor Anthony to beg for forgiveness. The manipulation was so deep. After that, I left home at 17. I never looked back, but I carried the shame with me until now. Funmi was in tears. Some women beside her in the courtroom did their best to console her. The judge listened carefully, then he spoke authoritatively. After carefully considering all the evidence and listening to the testimonies of the witnesses, I find that the defendant, Pastor Anthony, is guilty of the charges. The evidence presented is clear, and the testimony provided by the witnesses corroborates the claims made by the prosecution. Therefore, I hereby sentence Pastor Anthony to 5 years in imprisonment with hard labor. This court is hereby adjourned. When the verdict came, Clara held her breath. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Pastor Anthony's face crumpled. He screamed about injustice, about the devil, about betrayal. But no one was listening anymore. He was dragged by 2 policemen into the prison van. He cried bitterly. Months later, Clara stood outside a community center, watching as young girls walked inside, girls who had been abused, girls who needed hope. She had started an NGO named A Safe Space for Girls, an organization dedicated to ensuring that girls no longer suffer in silence again. We have come to the end of this story. Join me next time for another captivating story. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before you go, please help me grow this community. Click the like and share button. Subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting African stories. I honestly got you covered. Thanks for your time.